ChatGPT said, Captain Omar al-Rashid stood perfectly still in the Grand Hall of the United Nations. His polished boots pressed lightly against the marble floor, or the crisp green uniform of Zafaria's royal guard, each crease ironed into place. A single silver emblem glinted on his chest, the sign of his lifelong promise to protect his people. Around him, delegates whispered and cameras clicked, but Omar heard only the steady beat of his own heart. When he was a boy of 7, Omar lived in a small desert village on the edge of Zafaria's western border. The sun burned bright each day, and sand blew across their rough stone homes. His father taught him to respect every grain of earth and every person who walked upon it. A true guard, his father said, sees a threat not only with his eyes, but with his heart. Omar remembered those words as he knelt beside his father's sickbed one hot afternoon. His father was weak from an illness that no medicine could cure, and Omar pressed his small hand against his father's chest. He swore then to serve something greater than himself. By the age of 15, Omar was already known in the village for his calm strength. When a sandstorm arose, he helped guide travelers to safety. When a neighbor's goat wandered off, he tracked its hoofprints back home. His mother watched him with a proud smile, though her eyes held worry. She knew the promise he carried would take him far from their home. At 19, Omar applied to the Royal Guard Academy in the capital city. The academy's gates rose towering and cold, built of stone that carried the echoes of 1,000 guards before him. Each recruit learned history, diplomacy, and the art of defense. Omar studied late into the night, practicing each movement until it became part of his body. He learned to move like wind, silent yet unyielding. He learned to speak with courtesy, even when his own thoughts burned with anger. He learned to listen, because every person's story mattered. One winter morning, a letter arrived from the palace. The king had chosen a handful of guards for a special assignment, protecting the Zafarian ambassador to the United Nations. The young men gathered in the throne room, nerves thrumming in their veins. Omar felt his pulse pound as he knelt before the king. The monarch placed a heavy, gold-trimmed cloak upon his shoulders. "Carry our honor with you," the king said. "Show the world who we are." Omar stood, shoulders squared, and bowed deeply. The weight of those words settled in his chest. Now, 5 years later, Omar found himself inside the vast chamber of the General Assembly. He had walked these halls before, escorting dignitaries and ensuring order. But today was different. Cameras trained on every face. World leaders exchanged nods and polite greetings. Omar adjusted his stance, hands clasped behind his back. He reminded himself of his purpose, to keep everyone safe and to honor the trust placed in him. A hush filled the room as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rose to speak. His voice was firm, his words measured. Delegates leaned forward, listening. Whispers passed down rows of seats. Some viewed him as a peacemaker. Others saw a hard line. Leader Omar watched the room's tension grow like a tightening rope. Security teams exchanged silent signals. Every gaze in the room held energy like lightning waiting to strike. In the moments before the Prime Minister spoke, Omar's mind drifted back to his village. He imagined the dusty streets where he once played as a child. He recalled the laughter of neighbors and the way his mother's shawl smelled of lavender. He thought of his father's final words. "Protect life, Omar. Speak only when your words will bring peace." He let the memory wash over him, reminded him that a guard's true power lay not in weapons or force, but in courage and compassion. The Prime Minister began his address. His voice carried across the hall like a drumbeat. Omar's eyes scanned the crowd. He looked at each person as a human being, each with their own hopes and fears. Delegates scribbled notes. Some nodded in agreement, others folded their arms, expression unreadable. Cameras panned across the scene, capturing every eyebrow raise, every slight smile. Suddenly, a loud shout cut through the murmur. A man in the visitor gallery stood, waving a small flag and shouting in a language Omar did not understand. His face was red with anger. He held a sign aloft that read, "Justice Now." The man's sudden movement created a ripple of shock. Delegates gasped. Chairs scraped as aides rushed forward. Omar reacted instantly. He moved like the wind. stepped off his guard post and strode toward the gallery. Without a word, he reached the railing, his hand closing on the intruder's arm. The man struggled, waving his other arm wildly. Cameras swiveled to follow the action. For a moment, Omar's face was calm, controlled. He remembered his training. Use only enough force to restore order. He twisted the man's wrist until the flag fell to the ground. With a gentle but firm motion, he guided the protester away from the gallery and toward waiting security officers. The room held its breath. For a few heartbeats, silence reigned. Then applause rose from some corners, weak at first, then stronger as delegates realized the Prime Minister was safe. Omar released his grip and stood upright, brushing invisible dust from his uniform. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. He waited for orders, but none came. Instead, the chamber remained quiet, as if the entire world had paused. In that hush, Omar saw the Prime Minister's eyes. They were wide, a flicker of surprise passing through them. The leader's speech had been interrupted, yet he nodded once at Omar, a silent acknowledgement. Cameras captured the moment, and flashbulbs popped like distant fireworks. Delegates turned back to their notes, but the energy in the room had shifted. Omar felt it deep in his bones. His actions were more than a display of skill. They were a message. As the Prime Minister resumed speaking, Omar took his place again at the guard post beside the Zafarian ambassador. He watched carefully, ready. For anything, each word spoken in the assembly carried weight. Each gesture might spark hope or fear. But Omar remained calm, the memory of his village grounding him. He had come here with a mission not only to protect life, but to remind leaders that peace required courage from every person in this room. When the address ended, delegates stood and clapped. Some heads turned toward Omar and the other guards. He acknowledged their nods with a slight bow. Then he walked slowly down the aisle, flanked by his fellow guards. Porters crowded around the gallery steps, their microphones pointed like curious birds. Omar answered no questions. He offered only a respectful nod. His duty was to serve, not to speak. That evening, Omar returned to his hotel room. The walls were lined with photos of world leaders and painted landscapes. He sank into a simple chair by the window and closed his eyes. The city lights of New York shimmered below, distant and bright. He thought of the day's events, the sudden protest, the whispered tension, the flicker of surprise in Netanyahu's eyes. He remembered his father's words again, "Speak only when your words will bring peace." Omar knew he had acted without words today. His actions had spoken for him. But he also felt a shift inside himself, a recognition that one person, standing firm, could remind even the most powerful that peace was more than a paper pledge. It was a living promise, held in every heartbeat. As he drifted to sleep, Omar wondered what the morning would bring. Would delegates remember the guard who saved a life? Would they recall that a soldier's oath was more than a vow to stand? Watch It was a call to protect the powerless and speak with integrity. In his dreams, he walked once more through his village, where the sun rose gentle and kind. And he heard his father's voice on the wind, clear as daylight. "Carry our honor with you, my son." Omar stood at his post beside the Zafarian ambassador as the assembly hall filled with murmurs. He watched as delegates found their seats under the tall windows that let in soft daylight. Rows of dark wood benches stretched out before him. Row held representatives from different countries dressed in suits and colorful scarves. Flags lined the walls like silent witnesses to every debate held here. Quiet conversations floated through the air. Some spoke of economic aid. Others argued about climate change or human rights. But today's topic held a different weight. The agenda listed a resolution on peace in the Middle East. It was a subject many nations had tackled for decades. Here it was again, demanding fresh attention and fresh compromises. Omar adjusted the strap of his ceremonial sword. Though he hoped never to draw it, he carried it as part of his duty. The Zafarian ambassador turned to him and gave a slight nod. Omar returned the gesture. It was a small sign of solidarity. If tensions rose, he would protect the ambassador. First, after that, he would protect every life in this hall. A hush fell as the president of the General Assembly took the podium. Her voice was calm yet firm. "Delegates," she began, "we gather today with heavy hearts and hopeful spirits. We seek a path to lasting peace in a region scarred by conflict." She spoke of shared humanity and common dreams. Cameras in the gallery clicked steadily, capturing every expression. Omar listened to her words. He saw hope flicker in some eyes, and doubt in others. He noticed the Israeli delegation sitting together, their faces set. Across from them, delegates from Arab nations whispered to each other. He sensed a silent tension, like the moment before a storm breaks. He remembered the nights he had spent in the academy drilling scenarios for just such an event. They practiced crowd control, evacuation routes, even evacuation by helicopter, if needed, yet drills never fully prepared him for real emotions. Real fear, real anger. The Assembly President introduced the chief sponsor of the resolution, a delegate from Norway. The Norwegian spoke with measured passion. He recounted stories of families displaced, villages torn down, children who grew up knowing only loss. His words painted vivid images in the minds of listeners. Omar felt a tight knot in his chest. He had seen similar scenes on news reports. He'd watched images of children holding tattered dolls, eyes wide with confusion. He had felt grief for people he would never meet. When the Norwegian finished, applause rose, polite but careful. Then the floor opened for discussion. One by one, representatives took the podium. Each spoke in English or French or Spanish or Arabic. Their voices carried hopes for peace or warnings of continued violence. Some warned that the resolution did not go far enough. Others argued it asked too much. Omar kept his gaze steady on the crowd. He saw a delegate from a small Pacific island nation clutch a notepad as she shared her support. She spoke of the universal right to safety when she sat down. Omar offered her a respectful nod. She smiled in return, as if comforted by his presence. Then came the speech from the delegation of Egypt. The ambassador spoke in fluent English. Though his accent carried the rhythms of his native tongue, he described his own family's history, how his grandparents fled conflict when they were young. He urged for understanding and empathy. Omar watched the delegate's hand tremble slightly as he spoke. He admired the courage it took to stand there and share personal pain. Next was the Israeli ambassador. He adjusted his tie and cleared his throat. His voice was steady. He spoke of the terror his people endured. He described rocket attacks on cities, families huddling in shelters, and lives upended by fear. The hall grew still. Omar could almost hear the pounding of his heart as the ambassador recounted those moments. He remembered his own training, the simulations he ran to prepare for chaos. But this was not a drill. These were real lives. When the Israeli ambassador finished, silence lingered longer than before. Delegates studied their notes. Some closed their eyes as if the weight of the words bore down on their shoulders. Omar felt that weight too. He felt the gravity of every decision this assembly would make. He thought of his village back home. So far from this global stage, but connected by the same human longing for safety and belonging. As the debate continued, a shiver of tension ran through the hall. Omar sensed it even before he saw the man slip through the side entrance. The protester carried a sign. Its expression was fierce. His voice, though muffled by distance, carried anger. Omar's training kicked in. He scanned the exits. He looked for the nearest security team. He held his breath, waiting for a breach. The protester moved quickly. Delegates noticed him, pointing and gasping. A sudden swirl of movement erupted. Security guards sprang into action, but the protester pushed past them. Omar moved as well, stepping off his post. He thought of his father's words about protecting life. He thought of the sickbed, where he knelt as a child. He thought of the promise he made at the academy. He reached the railing just as the man struck out, swinging the protester aside to prevent him from reaching the podium. The man's shout echoed like thunder in the hall. A flash of fear and awe passed through the crowd. Cameras swung toward Omar, capturing every second. Omar grasped the protester's arm and held firm. He used gentle strength. He had no desire to harm. He only wished to stop the danger. The man struggled, but Omar's grip did not loosen, guided him down the steps toward waiting officers. Each step felt heavy, as if the weight of the assembly pressed upon him. He did not release the protester until the man stood safe between. Two officers, still shouting but no longer moving forward. Silence fell again. Then applause rose, echoing through the hall. Omar stood upright, his chest heaving slightly. He returned to his post, brushing off dust from his uniform. His mind raced, but his face remained calm. He reminded himself of his mission, to protect life, to uphold honor, and to speak only when his words would bring peace. As Netanyahu prepared to return to the podium, Omar watched his face closely. The Prime Minister's expression had shifted. Shock gave way to curiosity. Curiosity to gratitude. Before resuming, Netanyahu offered a silent nod to Omar. It was a small gesture, but full of meaning. It said, "Thank you." Omar inclined his head. In return, when Netanyahu spoke again, his words carried an added weight. He paused to address the need for security and unity. He spoke of finding common ground. Omar listened, noting the way the Prime Minister's tone softened as he acknowledged the pain on both sides. Delegates leaned in, hanging on each word. The debate resumed with fresh energy. Some delegates referenced the protest. Some spoke of the guards' bravery. A sense of unity flickered. Delegates who had argued passionately against the resolution now spoke of the need to focus on shared goals. Omar sensed hope in that shift. He felt pride in his role, not only for what he had done, but for what it had sparked a moment of reflection in a room full of powerful leaders. After the assembly ended for the day, Omar accompanied the ambassador back to their office wing. He passed through corridors lined with portraits of past secretary-generals. He felt the weight of history in those paintings. He thought of the long line of guards and leaders who had stood here before him. In the quiet of the corridor, the ambassador turned to Omar. "You have done more than protect me today," he said quietly. "You reminded us all of our duty to protect each other." Omar nodded, humbled by the praise. He looked at the floor, then back at the ambassador. "It was my honor," he said simply. That night, Omar walked alone in a nearby park. Streetlights cast pools of golden light on benches and trees. He breathed deeply, feeling the cool air in his lungs. He thought of the assembly's energy, the mix of anger and hope, fear and determination. He thought of the people whose lives depended on decisions made here. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pebble he had carried from his village. He turned it over in his hand, its surface smooth from years of dust and wind. He whispered his father's words again. "Protect life, Omar. Speak only when your words will bring peace." He closed his eyes and let the sounds of the park wash. Over him the rustle of leaves, distant traffic, his own steady heartbeat. He knew tomorrow would bring more debates, more voices. He knew tensions could flare again. But he also knew that courage, compassion, and a simple promise could change the course of a moment, and perhaps even a lifetime. With that thought, Omar pocketed the pebble and headed back to his hotel, ready to stand guard once more at the doors of history. ChatGPT said. Omar's eyes widened as he sensed movement at the far end of the chamber. The assembly's discussion had grown heated, voices rising and falling like waves. But then came a sudden burst of commotion from the visitor gallery. A man had slipped through a side entrance, weaving between seats as if driven by desperation. A placard with large, bold letters, though Omar could not read them from his position. The man's face was tense, his breath ragged. In that moment, the room froze. Delegates paused mid-sentence, their expressions shifting from concentration to alarm. Cameras swung toward the disturbance. Security officers sprang from their posts, rushing toward the gallery entrance. Yet the protester moved faster than they expected. He sprinted down the aisle, placard raised high, shouting words that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Omar reacted without hesitation. His training had taught him to assess threats in a heartbeat distance, speed, intent. The protester was close now, mere yards from the podium where Netanyahu stood, speaking about peace. If the man reached the Prime Minister panic could sweep through the hall. Chairs would overturn, people would scramble, and the fragile calm of the assembly would shatter. He moved like a shadow between rows of seats. He lowered his center of gravity and extended an arm to block the man's path. The protester saw him and tried to sidestep, but Omar anticipated the move. With a gentle but firm grip on the man's forearm, he steered him away from the podium. The man yanked back, his voice rising in protest. Delegates gasped. Some rose to their feet, others reached for their phones. Omar held the protester's arm close to his side, careful not to hurt him. He remembered his father's words, "See a threat with your heart." He saw not an enemy, but a man driven by conviction. He spoke in a calm voice, low enough that only the protester could hear. "Sir, please come with me. You are safe." He guided the man toward the nearest exit for security to take over. The man's resistance faded as he realized he could not break free. His breath came in heavy pants. Omar kept his grip steady but not cruel, led him through the crowd of guards who stood ready. The protester's eyes flicked to Netanyahu, who had paused mid-speech, his hands resting on the podium. For a moment, leader and guard and protester shared a single, suspended heartbeat. Then security officers surrounded them, gently taking the man's arm from Omar's hold and guiding him away. Silence swallowed the hall. Delegates and observers held their breath, waiting for something: applause, anger, shock. Instead came a soft murmur that built into scattered claps. Some delegates stood, offering hesitant ovations. Omar straightened, his chest rising and falling in measured breaths. He brushed an imaginary speck of dust from his uniform, his face composed. Netanyahu stepped away from the podium and crossed to Omar's side. The Prime Minister's voice carried an astonished warmth as he said, "Thank you, Captain al-Rashid. Your quick action saved us all." Omar inclined his head, eyes steady on the Prime Minister. He felt the weight of 50 cameras aimed at him, felt the eyes of the world upon his every move. Security cleared the protester from the chamber, and the assembly speaker called for order. Delegates returned to their seats. The microphones hummed back to life. Papers rustled as notes were passed. The assembly resumed the debate, but the air had changed. Words now carried real urgency. The room felt smaller, more intimate, as delegates realized how close they had come to chaos. Omar returned to his post beside the Zafirian ambassador. He watched the Prime Minister gather his thoughts, clearing his throat before speaking again. Netanyahu addressed the assembly with renewed vigor, but his words were laced with gratitude and a plea for unity. He spoke of the need to listen to every voice, even those who chose protest over diplomacy. Omar noted how delegates leaned forward, hanging on each syllable. After the session ended, the ambassador turned to Omar in the hallway outside the chamber. "Captain, you did more than protect me," he said softly, voice echoing against the marble walls. "You reminded us of our duty to protect all voices, even those that challenge us." Omar met the ambassador's gaze, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Late that night, Omar found himself in a quiet side room of the Zafirian delegation offices. The room was sparsely furnished: a table, 2 chairs, and shelves lined with books on history and law. High-hustled hands clasped, replaying the day's events in his mind. The faces of delegates, the flurry of guards, the protesters' determined eyes circled through his thoughts like a dance. He thought of the assembly's purpose: to exchange ideas, to seek common ground. Yet today words had almost failed. It was action that had bridged the gap. He had acted out of duty, but what he did carried a message far beyond security. It said that every person in this hall, from the most powerful leader to the lone protester, deserved protection and respect. In the quiet of that room, Omar took out a small photograph from his pocket. It showed a young boy with dusty cheeks standing next to his father in their desert village. The boy's eyes shone with resolve, the same resolve Omar felt today. He whispered, "I carry your promise, Father." He folded the photograph carefully and placed it back in his pocket. He stood and walked to the window overlooking the UN Plaza. Yellow streetlights shone on the fountain below. Cars passed, their headlights bright against the night. He closed his eyes, feeling the cool breeze. Brush his collar. He imagined the village wind, the scent of hot sand, his father's voice carried on the air. Tomorrow would bring more debates. Threats would emerge in different forms: words, protests, acts of violence. But Omar knew he was ready. He would stand guard, yes, but also stand for something greater. The idea that peace was more than an agreement on paper. It was a living promise that needed protection from every danger, even those born of passion and pain.
Ow.
He turned from the window and headed toward his quarters. His steps were steady, his uniform still crisp. In the soft light of the delegation office, he felt the quiet hum of purpose in his veins. The world had watched him today. He prayed they understood what he stood for, a world where every voice mattered, every life was valued, and every action spoke louder than words. Omar stood behind the rows of delegates, his uniform crisp and his gaze steady. He had returned to his post beside the Zafarian ambassador after guiding the protester away. The room buzzed with renewed energy. Leaders leaned toward one another, speaking in hushed tones about what had just happened. But Omar felt something else growing inside him, his sense that his duty did not end with protecting people from harm. He wanted to speak, to share a message that could reach beyond the walls of the assembly hall. He remembered his father's words: "Speak only when your words will bring peace." Omar closed his eyes for a moment and thought of the millions who watched this gathering on television. He thought of refugees in camps, children in classrooms without walls, families praying for safety. He remembered the faces of those who had suffered when leaders forgot their duty to protect. His heart pounded. He knew that if he remained silent, his actions might be seen only as a guard's routine response. But if he spoke, his words could remind the world of something larger. He looked at the ambassador and nodded once. The ambassador met his eyes and gave a small, encouraging smile. Omar straightened his shoulders and moved forward. Every step felt heavy with meaning. Delegates noticed him. Some frowned, confused. Others leaned forward, curious. Cameras swung his way. The assembly president tried to speak again, but Omar's presence at the front drew every eye. When he reached the podium, Omar paused. His uniform looked out of place beside the flags and ornate wood, cleared his throat, though barely a sound came forth. In that hush, he felt the weight of 1,000 flashbulbs. He remembered his training: to speak only when necessary, to be clear and direct. He let his hand rest on the podium's edge and breathed deeply. "Honored delegates," he began, voice quiet but firm. "Today I stood between a protester and a leader. I used force only to protect life." His words echoed through the hall. The Prime Minister and ambassadors held their breath. "I did not come here merely to guard one man or one moment." He paused, looking around. "I came here to guard an idea, that every person's life matters." A low murmur spread. Omar raised a hand, gently asking for silence. Leaders in this room speak of peace and security. They sign resolutions and make speeches, yet sometimes words alone are not enough. His eyes met those of delegates from every corner of the world. Action is needed. But action without compassion can become cruelty. Words without truth can become lies. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so even the interpreter booths caught each word. "I am a soldier, sworn to protect. But before I learned to hold a sword, I learned to hold compassion in my heart. I learned that a guard's duty is not only to block harm, but to open pathways to understanding." He straightened again. "The man I stopped today did not attack out of hate. He acted out of desperation." He wanted his voice heard. "We must ask ourselves, are our halls of diplomacy wide enough to listen to the desperate?" The assembly remained silent, the only sound the soft hum of microphones. Delegates shifted in their seats. Omar let his words land, giving each person time to reflect. If we close our doors to the cries of the oppressed, then no guard, no protocol, no security can save our world from collapse. He held his gaze on Netanyahu. The Prime Minister's face had grown serious, his posture still at the podium behind Omar. "Mr. Prime Minister, your duty is great. You speak for a nation that has known pain and fear. But remember, a leader's greatest strength comes not from power, but from empathy. Omar's heart raced, felt the full weight of his speech unprecedented for a royal guard in this hall. Yet he spoke as his father taught him, and as the king's cloak reminded him. Delegates, he continued, we are here today to shape a future where children do not fear the sound of bombs, a future where families do not wake to ashes, a future where every human being can live with dignity. He straightened once more and let his final words ring out. If any attempt is made to undermine peace, if any voice is silenced by violence, then history will judge us all harshly. And no guard, no resolution, no assembly will save us from the reckoning of conscience. He paused, letting the weight of that warning fill every corner of the hall. Remember this moment. Speak with courage, act with compassion, or be prepared to face the truth of your choices. Omar stepped back from the podium, his heart still pounding. The room remained silent, stunned by what they had heard. Cameras captured every second. For a moment, Omar felt naked, exposed to the judgment of every powerful person in the hall. Then, one by one, delegates began to stand. First a few, then more, until the entire assembly rose in a standing ovation. Hands clapped not just for his bravery, but for the truth he had spoken. Netanyahu climbed the steps to the podium, his eyes bright. He spoke then, his voice soft with respect. Today, Captain al-Rashid reminded us that peace is more than treaties. It is a promise we make to each other as human beings. He turned to the guard. Thank you for your courage and your wisdom. The Prime Minister bowed his head slightly. Cameras flashed as the hall erupted in applause again. Omar returned to his post beside the ambassador. Delegates offered nods and whispered words of praise. Some brushed tears from their cheeks. Omar held his posture, his uniform immaculate. Inside, he felt a calm wash over him. He had kept his promise to speak only when his words could bring peace. Later that evening, Omar walked alone through the UN Plaza under soft floodlights. Replayed the day in his mind, the chaos, the rescue, the speech. He thought of the protester, angry and hurt, who had pushed past security to make his voice heard. He thought of the delegates, tentative and fearful, who had risen to applaud. He thought of the Prime Minister, who had thanked him with real gratitude. He reached into his pocket and touched the small pebble from his village. He remembered his father's patient smile, the smell of lavender on his mother's shawl, the weight of the king's cloak. He whispered into the cool night air, I have done as you taught me, Father. I have spoken for peace. He looked up at the stars above the city skyline, bright against the darkness. In that moment, he felt connected to every soldier who had stood guard before him, and to every person who prayed for a better world. He believed more than ever that one voice could spark change. One act of courage could shift the tide of history. With that thought, Omar turned and headed back to his quarters, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. He had given his warning. The world held its breath, waiting to see if leaders would listen. Omar awoke, before dawn the next day, to the soft call of his alarm. The sky outside his window was a pale gray, hinting at a new beginning. He dressed carefully, straightening his uniform until each crease lay perfect. Though he felt tired, his mind buzzed with memories of the previous day. He remembered the roar of applause, the flash of cameras, and the silence that fell when he delivered his warning. He wondered how the world would carry that moment forward. Downstairs in the hotel, lobby journalists gathered around screens showing highlights from the General Assembly. The images of Omar at the podium, silhouette framed by flags, played on a constant loop. Reporters whispered about how a royal guard broke protocol to address world leaders directly. Some praised him as a hero. Others questioned whether a soldier should speak in such a forum. Omar passed by without stopping, offering a polite nod to the concierge. He kept his face calm, though inside he felt the weight of scrutiny. He made his way to the Zafarian delegation office, where the ambassador waited with a warm smile. The ambassador rose to greet him. Captain al-Rashid, the world is talking about you, he said softly. Your words reached beyond these walls. They stirred hearts. Omar felt a surge of pride and humility. He had never sought fame, only to speak truth when it mattered most. In the office, aides and diplomats moved about, preparing for meetings. A small television played news. From around the globe, in one broadcast, a reporter described how security experts analyzed Omar's intervention as a textbook demonstration of restraint. In another, an editorial board debated whether military officers should remain silent under diplomatic roofs. Omar listened quietly, his gaze steady. He knew that debate was part of progress. Questions raised today might lead to better understanding tomorrow. After meeting with the ambassador, Omar walked through the halls of the UN building. Of past secretaries general looked down at him as he passed. He paused in front of one painting showing a leader speaking passionately to the assembly. Omar thought of how history repeated itself. Words could ignite hope or fuel conflict. He placed a hand lightly on the frame, feeling a connection across time with those who came before him. Outside, the plaza buzzed with diplomats and visitors. Banners advertising conferences flapped in the breeze. Street vendors sold coffee and snacks to passers-by. Omar bought a simple sandwich from a cart and sat on a bench near the fountain. The water glinted in early sunshine. He watched people move. Some hurried, others strolled each with their own story. He chewed thoughtfully, remembering how he once watched travelers cross his village's dusty crossroads. Now he watched the flow of humanity in a city that never truly slept. His thoughts turned to home. He pictured the wide desert sky, the rocky hills, the small house where his mother still lived. He imagined her smile when she heard of his actions. He thought of the village children playing with sticks and stones, pretending to be soldiers or teachers or farmers. He wished he could tell them that courage and kindness mattered more than any weapon. He closed his eyes and whispered a silent prayer for their safe lives. Later, Omar joined a private meeting with the Zafarian foreign minister and other officials back at the embassy. They discussed the fallout from his speech. The minister praised his integrity, but reminded him of diplomatic limits. "Your warning carried weight," the minister said, "but we must balance honesty with respect for protocol." Omar listened, understanding both sides. He had spoken from conviction, yet he respected that his role was to serve his country's interests carefully. That afternoon, the UN held a special session on the Middle East peace process. Delegates referenced Omar's speech as they debated amendments. Some said his words lent moral authority to the resolution. Others said they highlighted the urgency of listening to all voices. The assembly president opened the floor for comments. When a delegate spoke of the guard's warning, she paused to acknowledge how one act of courage could reshape a debate. Omar sat among his fellow guards, wearing his ceremonial sword at his side, and watched as leaders coped with the ripple. The effect of his message. After the session, a young diplomat approached Omar. He introduced himself quietly. "Captain, I wanted to thank you," the diplomat said. "Your speech reminded me why I became a public servant. You showed us the power of empathy." Omar nodded, grateful. He realized that his words had touched even those who worked behind the scenes. He felt hope growing inside him. Night fell over the city as Omar returned to his hotel. The lights of the skyscrapers glowed like stars. In his room, he sat at a small desk and wrote a letter to his mother, described the assembly, the speech, the applause. He wrote of his pride in Zafaria and his hope for peace. He told her he missed her lavender-scented shawl and her gentle laughter. When he finished, he folded the paper and tucked it into an envelope. He would mail it in the morning. Before sleep came, Omar stood on his balcony and looked up at the moon. Its pale light cast long shadows across the rooftops. He thought of his father's grave far across the sea, under the desert stars, whispered, "Father, I carried your promise, and I spoke for peace." A breeze stirred his hair, carrying memories of home. He felt that his actions, though small in the vastness of the world, had mattered. In the days that followed, Omar's story spread beyond the UN. Newspapers in distant capitals featured his image. Alongside headlines of guards' warning and soldiers' speech, social media pages shared his quote, "No guard, no protocol. No assembly will save us from the reckoning of conscience." People wrote poems and essays about the moment. Some held small gatherings to discuss how individuals could hold leaders accountable. Omar learned that stories could travel faster than armies. Back in Zafaria, the king received Omar at the palace. The monarch placed a hand on Omar's shoulder and spoke in a quiet voice. "You have brought honor to our kingdom," he said. "Your courage reminded the world of our values." Omar knelt and kissed the king's hand, honoring custom. Felt the weight of the royal cloak again, not just as cloth, but as a symbol of trust. Weeks later, Omar returned to his village for a short leave. He rode through dusty streets in a simple car, not in uniform but in plain clothes. Children ran to greet him, eyes bright with curiosity. His mother waited at the door, tears in her eyes as she hugged him. Air smelled of sun-baked earth and wildflowers. Omar walked to his father's grave, brushing away sand from the stone. He spoke softly of his journey, of the assembly hall thousands of miles away, and of the promise he had kept. Villagers gathered to hear his story beneath a lone acacia tree. He spoke of duty and compassion, of speaking truth when it mattered most. He told them that every person had a responsibility to listen to the oppressed and to act with empathy. The villagers listened in silence, children wide-eyed, elders nodding in understanding. When he finished, they clapped and cheered. Omar felt the warmth of community, the bond of shared humanity. Da-da-da-da-da. Back at the embassy in New York, Omar resumed his duties. He escorted the ambassador to meetings and guarded the doors of negotiation rooms. But he did so with a quiet confidence. He knew that his voice had power, and he used it sparingly, always guided by compassion. Leaders sought his counsel when tensions rose, trusting his steady judgment. Years later, historians would look back on that moment in the assembly hall. As a turning point, they would study how one royal guard's warning influenced the peace process, how his speech became a call to action for leaders worldwide. They would ask if his courage changed the course of history. Omar himself would never know the full answer. He would only remember that he had done what he believed right. One evening, long after the debates had ended and the resolution had passed, Omar walked the empty UN plaza. The fountains were dark and the flags hung still. He stood on the steps where he had once spoken, looking at the silent hall beyond. He felt a gentle peace in his heart. He had guarded not only the bodies in that room, but the promise of peace itself. As he turned to leave, he whispered to the empty night air, "Carry our honor with you." And in that moment, he knew that the promise of peace lived on, kept, safe by every person who dared to speak with courage and act with compassion.